bienvenidos a todos y a todas a esta conversación, que más que una conversación va a ser más bien una entrevista, porque yo creo que ustedes que tienen ganas de escuchar no es al ministro hoy, sino al maestro Kent Nagano, al cual quiero agradecerle muchísimo su presencia hoy aquí. Hemos quedado que yo iba a intervenir en español. El maestro está ya estudiando español y veo que avanza rápido porque ya no requiere interpretación de mis palabras. Pero lo que primero que quiero decir es darle la bienvenida y decirle que es un orgullo para España y para la Orquesta y el Coro Nacionales poder contar con su dirección. La verdad que cuando pudimos anunciarlo, solo tuvimos palabras de entusiasmo y de agradecimiento por poder contar con una persona de la trayectoria y de la talla del maestro Kent Nagano al frente de nuestra orquesta y nuestro coro. Creo que somos unos privilegiados. Y la primera vez que pudimos sentarnos a tener una primera conversación, él y yo, hará aproximadamente 2 o 3 meses, enseguida surgió una idea de poder hacer una pequeña conversación para dar a conocer las ideas del maestro, sus intenciones, por qué le hacía especial ilusión también poder venir a trabajar con nosotros a España. Y ese es el motivo por el cual hemos organizado este pequeño acto, que creo que es de muchísimo interés para muchos de los amantes de la música que hoy estáis aquí y muchos de los que nos siguen desde sus casas. La verdad que el maestro Kent Nagano, para los que estáis hoy aquí, no necesita presentación prácticamente. Ha estado al frente, como ustedes saben, de las óperas de Lyon, de Los Ángeles, de Baviera. Ha estado al frente también de la Deutsches Sinfonieorchester de Berlín, en Montreal también. Y también ha podido dirigir nuestra orquesta en algunas ocasiones. Es decir, que nuestra orquesta no le es ajena, desde luego, y de hecho en algunas de sus entrevistas ha podido destacar el maestro Nagano pues, la gran calidad que tiene la orquesta en nuestro país y su importante dimensión internacional. Pero sí quiero decir que la llegada de Kent Nagano para nosotros, y esto sí que quiero que es el mensaje principal que por lo menos yo como ministro quiero trasladar, es que para nosotros es una grandísima oportunidad para dar un gran salto internacional a nuestra orquesta y a nuestro coro, que creo que no hay persona mejor para poder dar ese salto en proyección internacional que el maestro Kent Nagano. Por lo tanto, quiero agradecerle muchísimo que haya aceptado nuestra invitación y también agradecerle muchísimo a Félix Palomero y también a nuestra directora, a Paz Santa Cecilia, por haberlo hecho posible, que han sido meses de trabajo, de diálogo con él, para que aceptara poder dirigir nuestra orquesta y nuestro coro. Maestro, por lo tanto, bienvenido a España. Muchas gracias. Y quizá la primera pregunta que me gustaría trasladarle es ¿por qué ha aceptado? ¿Qué es lo que le motiva de venir a trabajar a España?
Well, first, may I say what a pleasure it is to meet you all here today. Thank you very much for welcoming me. Also, I will apologize that I speak in English today, but as the minister has said, I will be going to school. So next time I hope to speak with you in Spanish. The question of why I decided to come here is to me unexpected, because the Spanish cultural tradition is one of the most important traditions that we have in the world. It is so well known and so much celebrated, as is the National Orchestra and the Chorus of Spain, that, of course, it is a great privilege for all of us to have the chance to come to Spain. And for me in particular, to be given the opportunity to collaborate with this great tradition and to try to help serve as a cultural ambassador, to share this great culture and great tradition with the international community. This being said, I must also add that the orchestra and the chorus are also very, very well known internationally. They do not need an introduction to the world. But I would also say that today in the 21st century, it is perhaps more important than ever that we keep these great cultural traditions alive and we share them with each other. This is what will give the 21st century a great sense of hope and optimism. And so it is really with great pleasure that I can accept to be with you today, to work together with the Spanish community to try to share this great culture with the international community.
Muchas gracias, maestro. Y la verdad, repito que es un auténtico honor. Quizá podríamos iniciar esta conversación porque, bueno, una de las cosas que trabajamos mucho y que nos preocupa es de qué manera acercamos la música, particularmente a nuestros jóvenes. Después tendré alguna pregunta en relación a esto para usted. Pero quizá me gustaría poder empezar esta conversación preguntándole cuál fue su propia introducción a la música. Usted es una persona que tiene formación en humanidades, ¿no? Creo que estudió sociología y música, pero enseguida fue un devoto de la música. Sé que en su casa, desde bien pequeñito, tuvo la música muy cerca. Pero ¿cómo decidió usted convertirse en un director de orquesta? ¿Cuál fue su aproximación a la música y de qué manera la música ha moldeado su personalidad desde hace tantísimos años?
In my own personal case, I wasn't really given a choice. My mother was a pianist, and because I grew up in a very small town, isolated from any cosmopolitan center. This village was so isolated that by automobile it would take 5 hours to drive to the north, to San Francisco, and 5 hours to drive to the south, to Los Angeles. We were famous for having more cow than people in our village. And I was introduced to music already at my birth from my mother, and she decided to teach me piano when I was 4 years old. She explained to me at the time that this was for 2 reasons. One, she felt it was essential to have a cultural awareness, and that through music and the arts, beginning at a very young age, she explained it's never too old to be introduced to culture and the arts. But the earlier you are exposed to the arts, the more time it has to grow within you. The second reason is, she said, it's very good discipline. You will learn how to concentrate. So if you can imagine, well, my wife is also here today, who is a musician. Very often today's discussion that a child's concentration is perhaps between 15 seconds and 20 seconds. That's why in social media things move so quickly. But at 4 years old, we were required to sit at the piano and practice for 2 hours a day. And we had no problem to concentrate. It's a form of mental discipline, focus, concentration. And my mother felt that this was also very important. But this being said, I also grew up in the church. And in the church, we were fortunate to have a very active music program in the church. And I grew up singing in the children's boys' choir. Because I was a pianist, one day when the chorus master became ill, at 7 years old, he said, so Kent, you will take the rehearsal today with the children. So in a funny way, my conducting career began at 7 years old with the church choir. And fortunately, it seemed to have gone very well. And I have not stopped conducting since this time.
Le hacía esa pregunta de inicio también, maestro, porque una de las cosas que nos preocupa mucho, lo ha mencionado usted, es de qué manera le damos importancia a la educación cultural y musical entre nuestros jóvenes, ¿no? Y usted hablaba ahora del problema de lo que en inglés se llama el attention span, que tienen muchos de nuestros jóvenes. Seguramente la música es un gran vehículo para mejorar eso. Pero me gustaría preguntarle, bueno, yo creo que hay a veces la tentación entre muchos padres y madres de considerar la educación musical como una cosa secundaria, como una cosa que no tiene futuro. Me gustaría preguntarle cómo cree usted que podemos convencer a los padres y a las madres de dar mayor educación musical a sus hijos y de qué manera cree usted que además que esa educación musical les va a servir como un elemento formativo esencial a lo largo de sus vidas. Ahora hablábamos el maestro y yo antes de empezar la importancia, por ejemplo, que supone para muchas personas, para mí lo fue, desde luego, que la educación musical para el desarrollo, por ejemplo, del dominio de los idiomas y de tantísimas otras cosas, ¿no? ¿Cómo convencer a los padres de que esa educación musical es importante entre nuestros jóvenes?
It's true when we speak of music education, a very typical response will be, I do not want my child to become a musician. This is not what I imagined. I would imagine a more traditional career for my child. But it is important to understand that studying music is not necessarily to become a musician. I would even go further. Of all of the children that study music, perhaps 2% become professional musicians. What happens to the other 98% of children who have studied music? You need only to look around to see what the benefits of studying music are. I have already mentioned one of them, to have extreme discipline of mental concentration. This is not something that comes automatically. It must be studied, it must be learned. Secondly, to learn abstract problem solving, to learn how to play well a masterpiece of Johann Sebastian Bach or Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. For a young child, you have to learn how to take written symbols on a piece of music, to process this into muscular training, and then through muscular training, to be able to execute what the representation is of the page into mechanical action. Then, in addition to this, as a child, you have to learn to think existentially, which means to understand the past, because to play the Mozart C major sonata, you have to understand what note came before. You have to hear what note should come in the future, so that in real time you can realize whether you have played correctly or not. So you are simultaneously thinking past, future, and present, or existential thinking. This kind of abstract problem solving or awareness is essential in virtually every profession that we take. The business profession, the legal profession, the medical profession, the teaching profession, every profession requires this kind of abstract problem solving. And what music offers from the very early age on is how to creatively deal with a problem. We learn very young as musicians that fundamentally problems are not so interesting. They happen all of the time. What is interesting is to find the proper solution to the problem. I would say in addition, if you study music, you also learn social dynamics. For example, yes, I studied the piano, but I also studied violin and viola. I played in an orchestra. And by social dynamics, when you play in an orchestra, you learned respect for authoritative structure, not in the negative sense, but in the productive or creative sense. You also learn diplomacy. As a violinist, do I tell my partner, oh, you play very badly? Of course, you cannot say that. Oh, you played a wrong note. You can't say that. So you learn a kind of a social diplomacy. I would also say that you learn a social awareness. When you are playing the violin, you know exactly what the trumpet player is playing, far away. You know what the contrabass section is playing because, of course, it has a relationship to what you play as a violinist. This social awareness, together with social structure, negotiation, dialogue, conversation. You learn these at a very young age, and they will help you in any business that you turn to. This is why you study music. It allows you to realize your potential as a human being, and it allows you to grow at a much, much faster rate than people who do not have the chance to study music. And if I may say, this is not Kent Nagano speaking. This has been proven by neurological studies many, many times. Daniel Levitin, Dr. Daniel Levitin has written several books about the development of childhood mental process when stimulated through musical studies against those children who have not had the stimulus of musical studies. This is how best to convince a parent why they might have their children study music, because it allows a much stronger chance for a child to realize their potential.
Me encanta esta definición que acaba de dar de que la educación musical le permite a uno comprender mucho mejor su potencial como ser humano en cualquier otra disciplina. ¿No? La educación musical no tiene por qué llevarle a uno directamente a dedicarse profesionalmente a la música, sino que la educación musical le permite a uno comprender mucho mejor otras muchas facetas de la vida, ¿no? Y le va a servir a lo largo de la vida, ¿no? Yo creo que esa reflexión que hacía Maestro creo que es muy, muy importante. Vamos a la función a su comprensión o a cómo usted concibe la dirección de una orquesta, que es algo que he estado este fin de semana leyendo y escuchando muchas de sus entrevistas. Usted ha reflexionado mucho sobre ello. Creo que uno de sus grandes referencias, que es Bernstein. Usted decía de Bernstein que un director, que aprendió de Bernstein que un director no debe jamás interponerse entre lo que crea y el público. Y también decía usted de Bernstein en una entrevista que le decía que le leí hace poco, que también le daba mucha importancia, que usted decía de Bernstein que Bernstein era un gran comunicador, que además de la música, sus movimientos expresaban una comunicación en lenguaje musical extraordinaria. Me gustaría preguntarle cómo concibe usted el director de orquesta, a partir de lo que le ha enseñado Bernstein, de lo que aprendió Bernstein y de tantos otros y de su propia experiencia. ¿Cuál es la función hoy de un director de orquesta?
If I may begin by saying, to be a conductor, conducting a performance is by definition different from being a music director. They are two different activities. As a conductor, you work with your colleagues as a colleague, but also within a leadership function, with a responsibility for leadership. But essentially, you are colleagues making music together live. in real time. A music director is a different responsibility. So in the past, in my relationship with the National Orchestra and Chorus of Spain, I have had the wonderful pleasure of working together as a colleague to come to make live music together. And the chemistry and getting to know my colleagues has been each time an extraordinary experience. Being music director is a different kind of a responsibility. And I have described it in the past for those of you who drive an automobile. We use something called GPS, Satellite Global Navigation System. How GPS functions is that in order to understand where you're going, GPS will calculate the past from where you have come, will take the coordinates where you are at the present, and then calculate the various coordinations to go forward into the future, to arrive at your destination. So, at least for me, to accept the responsibility of music director, it is essential to study and deeply appreciate the past. In the case of a great orchestra like the Spanish National Orchestra and Choir, this means to understand the tradition. From where comes the tradition? The tradition is a reflection of a culture. So that means to go even further back to understand how and why this very rich cultural tradition came. Only in understanding the past can you understand how you are at this particular moment in time. Then it will allow the possibility to have a clearer idea of how this tradition, how this culture, what role it will play in the future. And by that I mean the 21st century, the rest of the 21st century. This, of course, is an exuberating process. Yes, as my entire life, I have been aware of and studied the great Spanish culture. I come from California, and as you all know, for us in California, we identify with Spanish heritage because that was the first wave of immigration that came to California. And until today, I still live in San Francisco, not far from San Jose, not far from Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, Monterrey, all of which carry, of course, Spanish names. So for those of us who are there, of course, we are aware, at least in some primal way, the importance and dynamics of Spanish culture. But I must say that over the past 6 months, I have been studying intensively this incredibly rich history of how the Spanish culture was formed. Because it's only through understanding the tradition that we can understand how this culture can play an important role in the development of our global community. From what we know, in many, many ways, the New World, especially today, and I'm speaking of my own home, where Spanish language is spoken more and more through our nation, to share the riches of Spanish culture, it is critical for us in order to go forward. So part of the role of a cultural ambassador, like a great symphony orchestra and their choir, is to serve the community, but also to have, in a sense, to radiate out to the international community and share what this rich culture means.
Y ya que estamos hablando de esto, Maestro, ya que estamos hablando de esto, ¿cómo cree usted que es percibida hoy la música española? ¿Prevalecen tópicos, miradas románticas, esencialistas? ¿Cuál cree usted en estos momentos que es la percepción de la música española en el mundo?
I think for those of us who live outside of Spain, the world of cultural arts, Spanish cultural arts, is universally recognized as one of the most important foundations of our world civilization. Just personally, I do not know of anyone that does not recognize the relevance of Spanish literature, Spanish poetry, theater, dance, visual arts, literature, music. Everyone whom I know understands. What is particularly interesting for me right now is the discussion of classical music's position in the future, because this is oftentimes discussed, particularly when I am asked, Maestro, how do you fill your houses with so many young people? Unfortunately, I get this question very often. For this, the question is more, what do you see happening today in Spanish culture that will have an influence on the future? And I must say that this is one of the most exciting things. There is currently, I can think of 3 specific examples. I will not name personal names today, of young compositional talents that I feel are extraordinary. These young Spanish composers, they have a unique voice, technical integrity, and they represent the highest level of art form going on. They are very young, these 3 composers, and I'm sure there are many more, and I look forward to discovering through my studies. This, to me, is why I feel so optimistic about the future of classical music, because we feel that through these composers who are now late 20s, early 30s, very, very young, that this means that there is a secure future for classical music, that it will maintain its relevance going on to the future, and of course, it will represent this great Spanish heritage going forward. So I feel optimistic, which I realize is a bit anti-trend. Today it's much more trendy to be depressed and gloomy. But actually from what I see now through my studies, and as you know, I'm quite engaged in contemporary music as well, there are very strong creative reasons to be optimistic from what is happening here in Spain. As far as bringing young people to the audience, if you allow.
Of course.
I am of a generation which we call ourselves baby boom generation, the generation born after the Second World War. And perhaps part of what makes an artist special is because in many ways we remain quite immature. We remain very naive. And I remember clearly in my childhood listening to my parents and sometimes becoming very, very upset. Mama, Papa, why do we have to do this? And my parents would say, it's because it's the way we've always done it, which is to say status quo. And this would make me very upset and angry. Why do we have to do status quo? What is the value in just repeating habit? A child or a young person, they have no patience for status quo, just because we've done it this way for the past 20 years. Secondly, as a child or a young adult, if I would go to performances where I would feel that the quality is not very good. For a young person, they are not yet old enough to learn that in real life we have to compromise. Young people have not learned to compromise. They expect the highest quality possible, and if they are given something less, it's obvious and it's unsatisfying. And the third and last thing is a feeling of superiority and condescension towards a young person. I don't think that you're old enough to understand this, so let me make it easy for you. For a young person to feel that someone of an older generation is speaking down to them is highly offensive, this condescension. So, to me, how to bring a young audience into the hall, it's not a mystery. These are 3 regulations. 1, no status quo. 2, only the highest quality possible. 3, to offer the most challenging program possible. No condescension. To return to my piano professor when I was 6 years old, who explained to me, Kent, if people do not come to a performance of Bach, Mozart, or Beethoven, remember, it is not the fault of Beethoven, Mozart, and Bach. It's not their fault. It's your fault. You do not perform them correctly, or you do not share them with the audience in a way that expresses their relevance. If you think about it for a moment, these great musical geniuses, they are geniuses because they are not status quo. They are geniuses because they represent only the highest quality, timeless. They do not condescend. They were written during the Age of Enlightenment, which means that they belong to an open society, not a closed society. And when they were presented to the public, it was not only new at the time, but it remains new to be rediscovered for all generations. If you honestly follow these regulations, my experience in Montreal, in Berlin, in Munich, and now in Hamburg, is that you will be rewarded with a homogeneous audience. In Montreal, for example, our average age, we were sold out every night. Average age was 34. Wow. So this is not because there's some secret. It's no secret. Simply follow these very, very simple regulations, which we all remember when we were young.
El maestro es un grandísimo innovador. Maestro, usted ha sido siempre un grandísimo innovador. Tiene especial querencia por la música del siglo XX, pero ha sido además un grandísimo innovador. Y en una de sus entrevistas, lo digo para seguir del hilo que usted mencionaba ahora de no mantenernos en el status quo, me ha interesado particularmente en una entrevista que usted dio, que decía que en su casa no gustaba el rock, que nunca quisieron que el rock entrara en casa, y que siendo muy joven, a los 28, 29 años creo que usted decía, un día se encontró con Pierre Boulez, y Pierre Boulez, de repente usted se dio cuenta que colaboraba habitualmente con Frank Zappa, y que de allí surgió una colaboración suya con Frank Zappa que luego le ha llevado a colaborar con artistas contemporáneos como por ejemplo Björk, con la que usted tuvo una colaboración muy estrecha. Esto me lleva a preguntarle un poco por la innovación en la música clásica, ¿no? Que a veces algunos tienden a pensar que en música clásica está todo escrito y lo que tenemos que hacer básicamente es reproducir lo que los grandes escribieron. Y usted ha roto un poco con eso, siempre tratando de innovar. ¿Qué papel tiene la innovación hoy en día en la música clásica?
Well, I'm not sure if I would call myself an innovator. I would say that I respect very much the tradition. The tradition of classical music is innovation. It is. It is only when we put it into a museum that we look at it as some form of art that is still live or is not living anymore. What makes music so special as an art form is that, yes, it is an art form, but it is ephemeral. It only exists for just a moment in time. Much has been written about when we as a public, or we as a performer, when we listen to music, we are only listening in the past, because from the physics point of view, the sound has already been made. It has taken a microsecond to travel to our ears, but we are hearing what has already occurred. We are hearing the past. Classical music, by definition, is something that represents humanity, that it communicates something that is separate from fashion. Fashion, mode, these are designed to have a very short lifespan. Then we look for something new. This is fashionable, tomorrow no more fashionable. For example, I am probably the only person that owns iPhone 4, because so many fashion has, what are we now, iPhone 16 or 16. Something? So the fashion it's meant to be short term, to have a short lifespan. Much of entertainment is very important, but it also is highly fashionable. What is top 10 today, tomorrow is gone. We're looking for what is top 10 tomorrow. Classical music is of a quality that it speaks to humanity, and that is to say that it is above time. It lives in its own world, or in other words, it is always new. It is always to be discovered ephemerally at this moment in time, just like a performance is only happening right now. When it's finished, we can never revisit again. Yes, we can listen to a CD, but this is only a representation. Yes, we can listen to a stream, a YouTube download. This is only representational of what has already happened. This idea that Johannes Brahms is the past is not true. Johannes Brahms doesn't exist except for when we play. And when we play Brahms, then of course we hear Brahms's genius, and more importantly, we hear and feel ourselves in his humanity. This is what sets the musical arts apart, and what makes sure that its relevance always stays. As long as we have humanity, classical music will always be a part of our expression. It's the one part that we can have confidence that it will be lifetime partner. Different from popular culture, which we enjoy very much today, but tomorrow we will look for something else.
Y hay otra cosa, maestro, que quiero preguntarle, que me ha interesado mucho de sus entrevistas recientes, que es esta idea de contestar la música clásica como un fenómeno cultural exclusivamente para una determinada élite, ¿no? Usted ha defendido mucho la idea de la democratización de la música clásica, que es una idea además que viene de la Ilustración. Le voy a citar en una entrevista reciente, usted decía: no me preocupa tanto la pervivencia de una industria de la música clásica basada en grandes estrellas, lo que me preocupa es privar a la gente corriente de esa maravillosa experiencia. ¿Cómo logramos que la música clásica sea lo más democrática posible?
As you know, I've written several articles, some books. Even though, as you point out, I was trained as an academic scholar, I was also trained as a musician. When I heard in America a very famous politician, and again, it's not necessary to give individual names, but a very famous, well-known politician explaining in a speech that classical music was not relevant for normal people because it was only written for the elite. This, for me, was, it caused great concern because this represented a very limited awareness of the history of classical music. Classical music, and again, we must be a little bit careful to define exactly what we mean in terms of classical music, because as we know, classical art forms, they can be folk art. This is still classical. Or some of the great songs or leader of the Beatles, for example, they have become classical now. So we must be careful what we mean by classical art forms. Better to look at socio-political constructs. So during the Middle Ages, much of the high art music was, unfortunately, primarily accessible to what we might call closed societies. So the aristocracy, the noble families, the monarchy, the church, these were relatively closed societies. If you would like to enter them, it was nearly impossible. If you were not born into nobility, very difficult to have access. With the Enlightenment came a completely different idea that beauty belonged to the expression of the entire humanity. To be able to communicate in humanitarian ways was something that all humanity owned and belonged to. A story that I like to give is, do you know why when we go on stage as a symphony orchestra, we wear frock, tails and white tie? Most people have forgotten why we wear that. Some people think that it's being arrogant or maybe elitist. But no, it was because at the time, very early days of free, open society subscription concerts of, say, for example, Haydn or Mozart. The musicians adopted this attire because it was the attire of working class. The nobility would wear long coats, very fancy pressed shirts, quite high maintenance hair products. And for the emerging working entrepreneurial class, if you had to reach a box up on your shelf or to carry your goods into your shop or to take the mail, these long coats were, or to ride a horse, they are not very practical. So the entrepreneurial class cut away, and they had then only the top part looked rather formal, but the rest was for practical use. This is what the young merchants, the entrepreneurial class, the working parts of middle class society, this is what they wore. And that's why today we still wear the frock, because this represented the democratic community. It was because of this particular time where Haydn began to tour the world. Mozart also toured Europe. Beethoven began his subscription concert series. Also, so did Mozart. In the openness to reach to everybody in an open society, their music also was written to speak in humanitarian terms, an open society. This is the history of our great music culture, and why it's very dangerous to think that it belongs to only a small segment of the population. It is meant to express the feelings of an open society.
Maestro, le voy a hacer una última pregunta antes de las preguntas del público, que tengo unas cuantas y las queremos también hacer para que pueda responder las preguntas del público. Una última por mi parte. Usted, que es una persona muy sensibilizado con las cuestiones sociales de nuestros tiempos, en tiempos, digamos, de cambio climático, en tiempos de contestación de los valores de la Ilustración, ¿qué papel cree usted que tiene la música en el contexto internacional en el que estamos viviendo? ¿Qué papel puede tener la música para seguir haciéndonos avanzar como seres humanos?
Music can and must address these issues. If we think about just back in history, during the mature phases of the Industrial Revolution, which began in England and then came to Europe, in order to power these industrial factories, fuel was required. And in those days, fuel came from primarily wood burning or coal burning. And in Vienna, to fuel the Industrial Revolution, it meant to cut down the Vienna woods. And the Vienna woods were a very important source of inspiration for Beethoven. And Beethoven, in walking through the polluted streams and the disappearing trees of the Vienna wood, began to feel that a part of his identity, the part of humanity, was being lost at the cost of the Industrial Revolution. So he wrote his sixth symphony called the Pastoral. And in the Pastoral, he paints pictures, various pictures of what happens in nature. What is the relationship between mankind and nature in its most harmonious, and when nature becomes angry with us. The Pastoral Symphony remains one of the most essential works of our literature today. A second example, when Haydn went on the first visit to London as a guest to perform before an immensely enthusiastic public, he saw London at the maturest point of the Industrial Revolution. He saw the pollution, he saw the destruction. And he wrote The Seasons, one of the most important pieces of our repertoire today, where he describes nature and mankind through the 4 seasons of the year. These are composers who place in a universal dialogue the ramifications of what mankind can do to nature. I must say that looking back in history as an anthropologist, every time that there is a technological step forward, a big step forward. Like the Industrial Revolution, it is almost simultaneously accompanied with a large step forward in musical art forms through composition. Now, as you say, climate change is very difficult to deny. Even my daughter, who will turn 26 years old, she can recognize in her own lifetimes that the climate has changed in the past 25 years. She feels this. And for those of my generation, it is really obvious. What can we do about it? The most important thing is to communicate and share through awareness that our humanity is completely bound to nature. If somehow that tie or that bound, those relationship is disturbed permanently, then it will have ramifications for us as human beings, just as Beethoven did, just as Haydn did. On a more immediate level, we had several climate-related disasters that took place in Quebec during my times there. And for each one of them, I asked the orchestra if they would join me to help the communities that were affected by climate-related disasters. And each time the orchestra said, yes, we will come with you. And we performed concerts superficially or officially to raise funds to help the community that had been severely affected by the disaster. But more importantly, I think, was to communicate a sense of solidarity. I often say that an orchestra is a metaphor for society. If you think about it, an orchestra, many musicians coming together, different background, different culture, different levels of education, different income class, sometimes even different nationalities, come together to try to achieve something that one individual alone cannot do. A metaphor for a community, a metaphor for a society. If this metaphor goes into the public, goes into the community to express solidarity, it's something perhaps small, but it is also something very, very vital for holding the society together. These are small things that we can do every day. We can do this. On a creative level, we can leave behind us great statements like Beethoven's Six or Haydn's Seasons.
Bueno, voy con las preguntas del público, maestro. La primera pregunta es de Rafael Ortega, de Scherzo, que nos pregunta lo siguiente, maestro. En esta era de streaming y de grabaciones en la que vivimos, ¿cuáles son sus planes o ideas para que la OCNE tenga más presencia en grabaciones y plataformas de vídeo y de televisión?
Well, this is an interesting question because in my studies over these the better part of a year, I have discovered how active Spanish culture is in media platforms. New technology is being born here in Madrid. Several new companies have been born. This is very, very important because new technology, of course, will affect all of us in the future. But even more than this, or just as importantly, to see the importance of Spanish cinema. I've already mentioned Spanish composition, Spanish presence on the internet. These are, to me, indications of very, very active involvement and presence in what will be the future platform for virtual communication. As I've said before, there is no substitute for live performance of a concert. When you go to a concert hall, what is a concert hall? So, yes, concert hall is where you might experience a musical performance, but it's more than that. Traditionally, concert hall is built in the middle of the city. Why? Because it is the place where the community comes together, a meeting point for the community, where we share an experience together, and afterwards we communicate with each other. Oh, I like that. I didn't like. You communicate with each other. Through this communication, of course, you reinforce certain fundamental values, humanitarian values. And a concert hall also not only serves as our meeting point, our living room, but it also serves as a platform where we can invite guests to come to our home. That's what a concert hall does, and therefore when you listen to a live concert, you are experiencing, in a real sense, humanity. Active, alive, dynamic, powerful. Streaming recordings, these are representations of what a live concert is. That's why, even though they can be very enjoyable, it's not quite the same as experiencing a live performance. Yes, I have some favorite recordings of historical archives, but I wish I could have been there myself personally to have heard some of these great artists of the past, but I can't. So I have to be happy to listen to representations. These are what the actual term is called virtual reality. And in searching for virtual reality, I oftentimes make a joke or a kind of observation. I remember 2 years ago when some very wealthy entrepreneurs decided to go to outer space in their own private spacecraft. Mr. Musk, Amazon, I've forgotten his. Yes. These various very successful entrepreneurs went to outer space to experience a different kind of reality. Right at that time, my wife and I were producing a cycle of all 32 Beethoven sonatas. And for the public who came, and they came to listen to all 32 Beethoven sonatas. I said, this is a much easier and less expensive way to experience alternate reality, is you come and listen to the 32 Beethoven sonatas. It is accessible to everyone. It is here. It's something that is representative of living humanity today, and it's something that we share as a community. That's what makes it so special.
Gracias, maestro. Antonio nos pregunta, de la ONE, nos pregunta, ¿cree usted que es importante para la orquesta la realización habitual de giras internacionales?
Yes, I do feel it's very important, but I wouldn't say this automatically. One of the things that I find very, very special about the National Chorus and Orchestra here in Madrid is that it represents a true, unique, completely unique tradition. This unique cultural tradition is something that you cannot buy. You can't pay for this. You can't consume it. It's something that can only be earned through hundreds and hundreds of years of rich cultural history, and then it is represented through a tradition. Today in our globalized world, and by this I I'm not saying that globalization is negative. There are many things that we all benefit from globalized standardization. On the other side, professionalism, as much as we all appreciate high professionalism, a tradition is something much more. A tradition should have excellence. It should have highest professionalism possible. But of course, that's just the beginning. It represents much more, it reflects much more than that. What an orchestra represents is a form of, if it is a unique tradition, it reflects a self-identity. One of the biggest compliments we can receive from the public is when the public says, "This is my orchestra." This is the biggest compliment we can receive. I remember riding the train between Munich and Berlin. We had just given a concert in Munich with the Bayerische Staatsorchester, and this concert, just by misfortune, it was the same symphony as a very famous international orchestra had played 2 nights before in Munich. They were invited as guests, and this very famous orchestra played the same symphony as the Bayerische Staatsorchester. And on the train, I heard 2 couples in front of me speaking about both concerts. And they didn't know I was listening as music director of the Bayerische Staatsorchester, but they were saying, yes, this international music orchestra was, they were very good, and they gave an excellent performance of the symphony. But when you hear my orchestra play, it's something different. And this, to me, was a great learning experience. To hear these people say, yes, this is my orchestra, it meant that when they go to a concert, they see on stage, they hear with their ears, and they perceive themselves. This is my orchestra because I hear myself. This is my orchestra, I see myself. This is my orchestra because I'm with my community. You cannot buy this. You cannot purchase this with money. It's something that only is earned through real tradition. If you have this real tradition, like the Spanish National Orchestra and Chorus, it should be shared, not just with the community, it should be shared with the global community. As I mentioned before, we are going through a transition phase in my own country at the moment. I will also say that the Hispanic language is spoken more and more throughout my country. This should be celebrated with a celebration of Spanish culture. Language is a representative of culture. And to share this with the arts culture internationally means that, yes, I think it would be very important that together we work on ties with the Americas, South and North Americas, and Spanish culture, but also through European history. We should work very, very closely through the Habsburg relationships with Austria, with France, to establish active and regular communication. Each one of these countries has not only the capacity to welcome international tours, but they also have very active media centers, radios, television, to be able to communicate. Spain has had a tremendous relationship with England, also Scandinavia, through, if you look carefully at history, also through Turkey and the Middle East. Very, very important ties, especially today in today's history, to share the depth of this cultural tradition, especially now. I think is something that we actively should try to promote, the potential of what this could bring to global awareness. I think is not to be underestimated. So yes, I realize that it's not so easy today to travel with a very, very large ensemble, hundreds of people. It's not easy to travel internationally. On the other side, at this moment, I feel the need for cultural ambassador. It's a very important role, and Spain in particular now, with this very, very rich cultural history, if they can share this tradition through ambassadorial communication, I think it will not only be appreciated, it will be very, very welcome throughout the world.
Hablamos mucho de eso cuando vino el maestro a verme, ¿no? Esa idea de la OCNE como gran embajadora de nuestro país, de nuestra tradición, de nuestra música, pero también de la España que somos hoy en 2025. Voy con la última pregunta y no las voy a poder hacer todas. Me disculparéis a aquellos que habéis hecho preguntas y que no las diré, pero voy a ir con una última. Pilar Jurado nos dice, ¿cuál va a ser, maestro, su planteamiento hacia la nueva creación musical española durante su titularidad en la Orquesta y Coro Nacionales de España? Algo nos ha mencionado, pero quizá lo puede desarrollar un poco más.
So I'm sorry, I didn't...
¿Cuál va a ser su planteamiento con la nueva creación? So what is going to be with the new performances and creations from Spanish musicians?
You mean a commission of new works, you mean?
Exactly.
Uh-huh. Well, of course, it's a very fair and simple question, but complicated answer. I will return to what I said at the very beginning. I feel the very, very first regulation, which I spoke before, to earn the trust of a public is to only share the very best that's possible. So this means that some of the repertoire will be well-known, standard repertoire. In fact, much of it, most of it will be. But if that highest quality also happens to be composed today or 2 days ago or 3 days ago, this should also be presented because it's our future, it's our actuality. And I would just add something else, and that classical music is a special art form because it represents what you can do. For example, I am pianist, so as pianist, if you go onto the stage and you cannot play Beethoven sonata, it is obvious that you cannot play. So you should not be on the stage. If you can play and you're able to communicate depth and many dimensions, then there should be no mechanism that would prevent you from sharing this with the public. There should be no discrimination. There should be absolutely no unfair playing partner. Quality of any kind of form, if it is integrity full and of the highest quality, from any background, from any source, it should then be shared with the public. And this we will work very, very hard to make sure that this goes on into the future.
Maestro, muchísimas gracias y gracias a todos por su asistencia. Para aquellos que quieran saber más de las ideas del maestro antes de su llegada, tiene una obra extraordinaria que se llama Classical Music, Expect the Unexpected, donde aborda, entre otras cosas, esta idea que hemos estado hablando de la música clásica como un fenómeno democrático para todo el público y no como una forma de arte elitista. Y en cualquier caso, maestro, darle muchísimo las gracias por haber aceptado, decirle que es todo un honor que pueda llegar a España y sepa que le recibimos aquí con los brazos abiertos y con muchísimo orgullo por tenerle entre nosotros. Así que muchísimas gracias, maestro. Gracias.